All right, it is August 29, 2022. Welcome to the Gateway API community meeting. We've got a few things on the agenda today to get through, a lot related to status, some supported versions things, and also a couple gaps. Thanks to everyone who made it out. Just a few reminders before we get started. One, this is a Kubernetes community meeting, which means we follow the Kubernetes code of conduct. Among many things, that includes just be nice to each other, nothing too crazy. Also, we want this to be open to anyone to participate. Feel free to ask questions, say anything at any point, and definitely add things to the agenda if you see something like that you would like to discuss. With that, let's get going. First up, next week is a US holiday for many of us that are based in the US. And so I know I won't be at a community meeting. I would suggest that we cancel the next meeting. If anybody wants to be around, they're welcome to meet. But barring that, I think I'll go ahead and cancel. Anyone opposed? All right, I'll run with that. Next up, I think we've got Nick. Nick made a lot of progress on this conditions and status work. I thank you for taking the time to try it. I know it had kind of been circling and we had a bunch of different issues. And so trying to summarize it is a monumental task. So thank you for taking that one on. I don't know, do you want to run through any part of that discussion here?
Yeah, I think so. If you scroll down, if everyone could have a look at this, I won't go through the specific things now, but I do want to go over the general things. Oh, so yeah, I think the general things that I think of that I've come up with are like stuff like, yeah, like I think we should try and make sure that we have the same names and like the same names for conditions and that the names do similar things, and that we use the same language across the whole API. So I think, you know, the example here is like attached. I think if we're gonna have attached, we should lean into attached and say like, you know, that gateway's attached to the gateway class that they're a part of, right? And so then the condition on the gateway that says this has been accepted by the gateway class shouldn't be accepted. It should be attached because and that way it's using the same concept over and over again. Like I'm not 100% wedded to that one, but that's an example of how we could have a concept be reused in multiple parts of the API and have the same word and the same concept sort of line up as much as possible. And so I think, you know, obviously the converse also applies that we shouldn't use the same word for something that's not pretty much the same. So yeah, I'm going to spend some time going through and sort of thinking about the actual conditions we have and whether or not we keep them or rename them and stuff like that. The TLDR, as I said, is if we change any of that stuff, it's going to break conformance. Like everybody who's got an implementation that passes conformance will need to fix their status things because we check the status in the conformance. So I think that we really need to get this done as soon as possible, get it synchronized and harmonized across everything. Yeah, and I think the other stuff that I've got in there, I think that, yeah, we should definitely mandate the use of observed generation. Now, I think I've talked about this in some other stuff before, but every Kubernetes object has a metadata generation field that is auto-incremented by the API server when the spec is changed. So every time you change the spec, the generation field gets incremented. And if anything changes the spec. So having the conditions struct has a field called observed generation, which is intended to be used for any time you put an update to the condition in there, you set the observed generation field to the generation at the time that you saw the resource. What that means is if the resource is changing rapidly, or if it means that there's a built-in staleness check on the condition. And so I think that, you know, the only reason I think I haven't confirmed this by checking with API machinery, but I think the only reason that's not mandatory is that it wasn't mandatory to start with, and you know, and nobody wants to go back and change such a core part of the API because that's painful for like not really much gain. But I think that there's no reason not to use it. The other things are, yeah, as I said, I think we should have 2 positive polarity check conditions. By positive polarity, I mean you want them to be true. They are true in the happy case. That are summary conditions that tell you need to look at something else on the resource or go somewhere else to get more information. And so you should, by checking those 2 things, you should know if the resource that you control is like reconciled to by the controller, and then if it is ready to pass traffic. Ready has a whole bunch of issues. Ready has a whole bunch of issues, but that we need to also discuss.
I just one question related to all of this. I appreciate and agree with your idea of observed generation here as like something like we should enforce, probably having conformance, etc. One of the things that I don't think we've ever provided consistent guidance on is what we do on those kind of intermediate updates of a route was programmed, we updated the route, and then it needs to be programmed again. Does, you know, like let's say we have a programmed condition. Is that something like we say should stay true and just not increment observed generation until it's true again with the new observed generation? Or do we go true, false, true? And
so you're saying you have a route that has been reconciled or attached or whatever, and it's successful, everything's good. Make a change to that route, and then you need to does it flip back to false while you're in the process of making the change? Is that right?
Yeah.
So I think that it's one of those things where we almost need to define it in sort of time-based terms and say, if it's longer than this time, you need to do it. You don't want to do too many updates to the API server for no reason. But at the same time, if it's going to take 5 minutes for the infrastructure to be provisioned, then you kind of want to know that it's been accepted. So I think it's almost like we need to write it out as this is the ideal situation. If you are pretty confident this will happen in a small number of seconds, then it's okay to skip over the intermediate write. But otherwise, you should do the intermediate write or something like that. I don't know. Like I think some of our definitions around this are going to need to be time-based rather than absolutely guaranteed, because eventually consistent.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I think that's a good enough answer for now. Yeah.
So yeah, like I said, like as you have said, there's a lot to this. If you have a look at that the spreadsheet that I linked down the bottom, I sort of went through every resource and every condition and every reason. Like, what is this for? Like Mike did earlier. And so I think there's quite a few questions in the should this be changed? And I saw I really appreciate what you did before, Mike. It really got me started on thinking about this. I think we've actually done a lot of what you had listed in that original issue. But yeah, the more that we've done, the more I've realized the more I've noticed the stuff that's not done. Keith, to answer your question in the chat, there's no strong guidance around positive polarity conditions versus negative polarity conditions. When we've asked API machinery before, they've sort of been like, nope, we're not making any statements about that, right? So it's my personal opinion is that you should have a small number of positive polarity conditions to serve as like flags that you can check to tell you obvious things. Ideally, it should be one, probably, but I think our API is complex enough that we probably need to just to tell the difference between config okay and ready to pass traffic.
Would it make sense to have like a predefined list at the API level that says like, here's just the list of all the positive and negative polarity conditions so that you can just like loop through them, and if you find any negative, then you can mark it not ready? Is that?
I think it's a little funky because the thing that a lot of the time, the thing that should be updating the ready status is the thing that should be managing the other conditions as well.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's going to be the conditions are not really for the controller to do generally. They're for people. They're for humans to look at rather than to be programmatically consumed. In the past, when people asked API machinery for ways to make this easier to be to programmatically consume, they've been like, nah, these are for people, not for machines. We're not going to do that.
So we in fact like should not do that, because I think we have at the moment some stuff like, you know, basically like generate all the like inspect all the possible error conditions first and add them to the condition list, and at the end go through those to say like, okay, is anything blocking me from becoming ready? If no, then I'm ready. If not, then
I mean,
leave it.
I think that in my mind that is a perfectly acceptable
Okay.
sort of way to internally process. But like in terms of like it doesn't, as far as the user is concerned, they only care that the conditions are present. You know, one thing that Rob and I have sort of disagreed a bit about on is like if we should mandate that all of the conditions are added. I tend to lean in the case that all of the conditions should always be present, because that means that you can always know the full status of the resource. That's how the core Kubernetes ones work. Like if you look at Node, it has a ready condition and then a bunch of specific error conditions. Like there's a problem with Docker, there's not enough memory, you know, those sort of things. And so if any of those are true, the ready one is going to be false, but you have the ready one to be like, do I need to look more at this node? And so that's a lot of the design cues I've taken here are from stuff like Node and Pod, about where the conditions I feel work pretty well.
Yeah, and to clarify, I'm not necessarily against conditions always being present. What I'm against is negative conditions always being present, where you have this double negative in your healthy state of, you know, like unhealthy equals false as a condition, and that just doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah,
but that's rather arbitrary.
Yeah. So yeah, I think for the positive polarity conditions is really important that, as Mike mentions, that we have the positive polarity ones. But I think as it all comes down to the naming, right? Like it all comes down to like if the names of the negative polarity conditions are some error is present, like and the error is very clear. Like I think detached false is like a bit weird because there's a very clear better way to say detached false, which is attached true, right? Like, but like if it's something really specific, like, you know, your TLS thing, there's a problem with your TLS certificate false. You know, like if it's TLS certificate problem false, then that's like, hey, there's no problem. Like, you know, like that feels a little bit more user friendly to me. Yeah. So, and I think Keith, you mentioned about. Yeah. I think conflicted is one way that it's hard. You mentioned about, I would say be extremely careful about using conditions as a state machine. Go and read the section in the API conventions on conditions like 4 or 5 times. It's very pithy. It's, you know, a bit difficult to pass. But it has so much pain and suffering distilled into that into those few short paragraphs that I think is really worth, like, take it and make it part of you, man. like if you're doing API design in Kubernetes, you really gotta have that API conventions doc bookmarked. So anyway, sorry, I've rambled on a bit, but yeah, this is not done. But I do think that doing something about this should block 060 and trying to clean this up as far as possible, because it's going to be a breaking change. We only want to minimize the number of breaking changes. So I'm be spending a bunch of bandwidth on trying to tidy this up and get something sorted out here. In terms of the next steps, I kind of posted that initial summary because I just wanted to get some people to +1, you know, some of the things, and tell me if any of that stuff is way off. If everyone's in agreement with the general stuff, I will start the process of writing up a small gap. Well, it may not be that small, but in that gap, I'll be very specific about the changes I want to make. Like I'll have I think we should do this in general, and then we need stuff like we need to change detached to attached, and we need to do this, and this field needs this updated, and this field needs this updated, so that there's a big to-do list of stuff to do, so that then we can burn it down as quickly as possible. Because I think a lot of these things are pretty straightforward changes. It's just figuring out what changes we need to make is the hard part.
Without opening up too much of a rabbit hole here, as far as the transition plan, I think what we're proposing here is adding new conditions and eventually removing some of the existing ones, like replacing or renaming some of the conditions that exist today. do you think that it's worthwhile to have one release of the API where we recommend setting both new and old?
I don't know. I mean, part of me kind of says it's gonna, what we do is gonna break implementations anyway. It may be better to have a hard break and be like, guess what? There's no getting around. You got to update these things to be conformant. You just got to go and update them now. It sucks, absolutely, and I feel bad about doing that. But I feel like if we don't, it's like all we're doing is pushing that can like one release down the road, right? You're going to have to update. You're going to have to make things. And also, if you think about how to write the conformance tests, how are we going to write the conformance test to be conformant if we don't have only one way to set the status? Right, that's going to really suck for the conformance tests.
Yeah, no, to clarify, what I was suggesting was and I don't even know if I was suggesting it, but specifically to still have conformance tests just check for the new conditions that we recommend, but somewhere in the documentation implementation guidelines say you may want to also set this old thing for anyone that's going through the upgrade process. I don't know if it's worth that effort.
I think it's likely that we at least would do that in practice, even if it's not explicitly recommended.
Yeah.
I'd kind of prefer not to make any statements about that and leave that up to implementation orders. And say like, this is the spec is the spec, and there's conformance tests to check that you do the spec. If you want to do the other stuff, that's okay. But yeah.
I think the caveat then is basically just not removing the deprecated conditions from the exported API in 060, at least deferring that to 07.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. I'll clearly mark them as deprecated, and they will be removed in 07. But yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Yeah, like as I said, I am sorry to be like there's a lot of work in fixing all the status flows, but I do think that the longer we leave it, the more work and the worse it's going to be. So.
Cool. Thank you again for taking this one on. Looking forward to GEP on this one. Yeah, is there any additional feedback or help you could use from us between now and a GEP? Or
yeah, if people could just have a look over that big comment. I know it's a big comment, but if there's anything that you don't like in this case, I'm going to take silence or lack of comments as complete agreement with what I've written there. So if you don't like that, then you better say something. Is what I'm saying, because otherwise it's going to take me forever. So, and I really, we're burning time. The time is ticking before keep on. So,
I wanted to ask a couple follow-ups. One on reference grant. I remember seeing this and then I forgot to follow up on it, but you suggested a condition on reference grant, and reference grant is one of those confusing resources that doesn't have a clear owner. If we add condition there, who publishes, who's responsible for writing that?
So I think in terms of the person who creates the reference grant, there absolutely is a clear owner. The owner of the reference grant is the person who owns the resource that the reference grant is granting reference access to, right? But I think it should be the condition, the controller that is implementing the reference grant needs to mark that condition as syntactically valid, or yes, this is referring to a kind that I support, or or something like that. That's the main thing there is it just needs to have a space for you to say this is going to work, right? And you don't. Otherwise, the only way that you're going to know whether or not the reference grant is doing anything is by sort of poking at things and seeing if is by other conditions on other non-related resources, right? Otherwise, the only way that you're going to know the reference grant work for a secret is working is if the route that you're referring to the secret in, or the gateway you're referring to the secret in, is I can't find that secret because its access is not permitted.
And to clarify, would this be another controller namespace thing where
I think so,
each
yes.
controller? Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
I think
that makes sense.
In cases like that, I think that's really the only way to ensure that the condition stuff is safe is that it's namespace by controller name. Unfortunately, it would be nicer if there was another way to do that, but I don't think there is in our use case.
And so I think this is a good, again, maybe another rabbit hole, but a good point for our implementation guidelines somewhere of anyone who is responsible for creating a controller name, and like some controller names like GKE is going to span multiple gateway classes. And we want to make sure whatever that controller name represents has the exact same interpretation of, like, there's no room for variance in how it interprets a reference grant or some other resource.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Cool.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I think that, I mean, I think you're right that we need to ensure that that stuff is there. It does feel like there are kind of a lot more things piling up where it's feeling increasingly to me like we need a dedicated implementers guide kind of page that has, you know, extremely in-depth things that you need to read when you are being an implementer of this API.
Yeah. Yeah, big plus one.
It's on my to-do list. It's a big list.
Yeah, same. Cool. All right. That's all I had. Or John, actually, you're asking a question. Yes, GK does have 2 controllers, but both of them implement multiple gateway classes.
Yeah, my concern was I came in halfway, so maybe it's the actual message, but it sounded like you were saying that for all gateway classes within one controller, they need to report status the same way.
Within one controller. So this is in the context of reference grant, and the idea of, if we add conditions to reference grant, how do we namespace that? And the idea was we throw in controller name on condition. And my comment was we just need to make sure that anything that is shared under a single controller name is guaranteed to have the same understanding of that resource or any resource like that.
I see. Yeah, I mean, so it doesn't actually impact my implementation, but I think it impacts yours. So if I'm wrong, just tell me and we can move on. But it seems like if you have a single cluster controller and a multi-cluster controller, the single cluster one doesn't know what like a service import is potentially. So that may be a concern.
Yeah, yes.
But
yes.
I would say
So
that you or other people that have that issue should figure it out, because I don't know enough to know if that's a real issue.
No, you're right. I need to double check in how we represent our controller name. I can't remember if we have 2 separate ones or one. There are 2 underlying controllers. Yeah, but you're right.
From an API design point of view, with the rest of the API, that has how we have namespaced conditions is in general by controller name.
Yeah.
2 collisions.
Yep. Cool. Okay, I think that's it for this one. Any last thoughts? All right, I'll move on. Next one is mine. Just coming back to the supported versions discussion from before. This is one where actually, this is related to GKE. Oh, everything has been resolved. Cool. But there was a discussion here about a proposal I had to commit to supporting the most recent 5 Kubernetes versions, Kubernetes minor versions. Rationale for that is, we already discussed this in the last meeting, so I don't want to go too far into it, but the rationale was really just trying to provide a consistent experience and ensure that we don't go back to that same painful transition that we had from Ingress v1 beta 1 to Ingress v1. Basically, where you can have one controller that supports the latest API and supports the vast majority of Kubernetes users. Yeah, it seems like we have gotten some consensus here more recently over the past few days towards supporting 5 versions. But I know that was somewhat controversial in the last meeting, so I wanted to bring this back up again and give anyone a chance to voice any hesitation towards this. This is a big commitment that affects the future of the API. Any decision we make here, we could regret in the future. Like Shane mentioned, it is harder to go down, like once we say we're going to support 5 versions, it's going to be pretty difficult to say in the future, oh, actually, we only want to support 3. So just throwing that out there. I think this is something that reflects the reality of Kubernetes today, the reality of where users are. And also, I referenced a few popular Ingress implementations that are supporting 5 or more Kubernetes versions today. And I think there are more that I didn't reference, but anyways, any thoughts or hesitations here?
I mean, I have thoughts, but I'll wait for anyone else before I go. Oh, okay. So my thoughts here were originally in the LTS working group, it took us a long time to agree that 3 was a good policy for upstream. And so I was like, well, why do something different upstream? 3 should be good enough for anyone. Famous last words. But yeah, I think Rob's point about the fact that having the CRDs not be too dependent on the versioning sort of means that we can say, hey, we support 5, but practically it'll probably be much more than that. It'll work on many versions. But the reason for it to have a line in the sand at all is so that if the CRD spec itself, not the spec that we write for our CRDs, but the spec for the custom resource definition resource gets updated, then this is how long we're going to have to wait before we can start using that stuff. And the big feature here is the CEL, the evaluation language that can basically replace a lot of the logic that we have in the webhook. It would be really nice to be able to use this, without having to have, and that would mean that we may not need to have an admission webhook anymore, which would be great, right? Like much easier to people not have to do that. But as Rob says, as the CL, the presence of the CL stuff in the CRD sort of ages, then we should be able to implement it in a safe way. Once that sort of 5 period has happened, then we can just start flipping things over and pulling code out of that coding. It just means we've got to wait, which at the end of the day, for a spec like this, is not the end of the world. I think we do want to minimize the breaking changes. So that's why I was persuaded in the end, even though I was very strongly 3 versions only to start.
I realized after, and I appreciate that feedback. I realized after I hadn't heard anything from anyone on the Gamma side, any of the Gamma maintainers, and this could affect things from that perspective. Maybe just do you have any preference on this? Okay.
I think I saw a point in the PR about supporting more Kubernetes versions means we're able to only support the latest version of the spec. And that's a pretty big win, in my opinion. I was also in the 3 versions camp previously, but I think once I saw that point, I kind of moved over to the 5 side, because once you're making that compromise, you can be a lot more strict about versioning the spec. And speaking from the Gamma use case, I like the potential of that to be able to iterate on the spec with version of the gateway API and whatever we figure out with Gamma, and not have to have that traditional N-2 version support, and be able to just kind of with the compromise struck here. So I change. That's my personal opinion.
Great. Yeah, that's good to hear. And I should give a little bit more background on that idea, because it is key. The idea of, if we support 5 trailing Kubernetes versions, what that means for at least GKE is that we can say, when a new version of the API is out, we can just roll it out to our fleet. We don't need to say this, stable channel, regular channel, etc. has this older version of the API, and then our controller needs to support this wider range. We just say this version is out, it's on our fleet, and it's done. So that's really compelling. And I imagine that will be the case for many other Kubernetes platforms, users, etc. And so although it does mean it's slower for us to adopt compelling new things like CEL, I think it's a net win in terms of simplicity to adopt and implement this. Okay, I will take that as good to go. If I can remove the hold on, I don't think I added a hold on this one, so I'll remove that. And if anyone feels like adding an LGDM, we can go from there, but I think we're good to go on this one. Thanks for the great discussion here. Okay, next one is back to Nick, backend properties.
Oh, not this guy again. Okay, so yeah, basically I just wanted to call out, I think this one's actually pretty close. I think Mark had some sort of good comments about how you remember to take into account the gamma distinction between the front end and the back end of the service. But I think I have been, as I said there, I think that the ingress usage, the ingress gateway API usages basically only really talk about the back end of the service. They don't need the front end because the routes are the front end, right? Like the routes and the gateway is the front end. Like that's the only thing that you care about in terms of naming, and that's the point of the rest of the gateway API. And so, I mean, I think maybe I just need to rewrite the why section to sort of make it clear that this is all about the stuff that the ingress needs, and the stuff that's tightly bound to the back end / bucket of endpoints / that sort of thing, not to the front end, which privately I am kind of thinking as the front end of the service is like the service identity. Like that's the way that you talk about a name and the identity that the service has. Yeah, so Shane sort of mentioned that he would prefer to merge this one as provisional and then come back and change it later. That's kind of where I am too, but I will do a quick pass over the why section, just to make sure that I've made clear that this is talking about the so that the load balancing example I need to make clearer, because it's actually the reason I included that is that it's a very critical distinction in my mind, is that when you're talking about load balancing properties, there are two places in which you want to set load balancing properties: on the front end and on the back end, right? Like, and in the case of the front end for the ingress gateway API, that front end is effectively at the route level. You want to be able to load balance between routes or between rules in routes, as opposed to the back end one, which is that when you actually make a decision to route to a back end, you need to know which endpoint out of that back end to pick. And so there are different places and there are reasons why you might want to have different load balancing algorithms at different levels. But the ones that we're talking about in this are the ones, how do you pick an endpoint out of a set of endpoints, not how do you pick a route out of a set of routes. I'll try and update.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
I agree with that clarification, and in general, I've read this. I'll never it's over, but I tend to agree with Shane as well. Nothing here seems to be too objectable, and would love to see this get merged and work on some more of the implementation details. Because being selfishly, from a gamma perspective, that's where I'm really interested to see what the kind of what the parity is going to be between what we're talking about with like service binding and this backend properties. There's a lot of stuff to figure out there, but yeah, at a high level, all this sounds good to me.
Yeah, I just echo what others have said here. I think this is just about good to go. Ping, well, I mean, anyone I think would add an LGTM to this. I think you just want to do one more round of cleanup, and then I think any of us will LGTM it.
Cool. I'll ping it in the channel or something when I'm done with the round of review, or you can just check it tomorrow your time.
Cool.
If you check it tomorrow first thing when you come in, I should be done.
Sounds great. Okay, next one is we're on to triage now. Cool. So I wanted to cover this gap. We ran out of time last week, but this is Sanskar, I believe. They're kept on response header filtering. A header for response filter for response headers. We'll get there. It seems like this is in a really similar state to others as well, in the sense that this is awfully close and there's nothing terribly controversial left in this one. Sanskar asked in Slack earlier, I think it was yesterday, my time at least, a couple things that have come out of this that are kind of broader issues. One is, can we do this at a higher level? Like, can we do, I think Candace might have raised this specific feature request, but can we just say, I want all responses within this namespace or from this gateway or whatever to have this header added or removed or whatever it is. This has a section in the proposal, but it's probably something that could be a separate gap. I tend to agree. I think Mike mentioned in Slack as well that this is just something that can be a future gap, future work. It doesn't need to block this. The other one I'm less familiar with, I think this was also a feature request from Candace, and I didn't completely understand it in the bit that I looked at it, but I think it was the idea to conditionally modify, it's this comment anyways. Yeah, so if it's, maybe Candace, you can probably explain it better than I can.
Do I remember this? Well, I think this had to do with if we wanted a value to be returned that was dependent on some activity that happened in the back end. So not a hard-coded value, which is the, that's what he's doing here, is a hard-coded value, but a value that was determined by something happening at the back end.
My question would be, how would you determine what happened to the back end though? Would that be done in a response header set at the back end? In which case that would make what you're talking about be like setting a response value, a response header based on the value of another response header?
To some extent, yes. However you manage to implement it.
Well, I think that's one of the things we have to be pretty specific about what is being implemented, that like if we're going to have something like that, then it's going to need to be very specific about what you are allowed to take information from and how the thing works. Like we can't leave that too open, unfortunately. So that's why I was like, if we're going to do that, I think that would be the way to spec it, to say, hey, if you want your back end to be able to tell your intermediate layer to add headers, then you need to do that with a header, right? Like that's really the only mechanism that you have where the back end can talk to the proxy, because it's metadata side channel.
You couldn't set up some kind of value here that preserves a variable, which is then referenced in the back end and changed in the back end, not necessarily delivered back to here by a response header.
But
is there essentially like,
yeah, sorry, you go.
Is there essentially like some side channel that the proxy has to the specific backend application that it'd be able to use to infer that value? Because outside like headers in the body, and like the body gets into a whole other mess, I'm not really seeing where else we like get the additional values from.
So yeah, I mean, unless you're talking about, are you talking about say, okay, backend sets something in its response, the response goes through the proxy, hits the client sends something back in its request. And then like on the second turnaround, you use something about some part of that loop to set another one. Like, but it feels like, as Travis said, like, it feels like to me, the only place where you have to communicate that information is the headers in either the request or the response direction. But yeah, but I'm just trying to understand. I don't like, I'm not sure where you could take that variable from. In general, we've tried to make the resources completely independent. So you can't like set a variable in a gateway and have it accessible in the route, because because you want the route to be able to attach to any old gateway that may or may not set the variable.
But here, so you're sort of linking these filters to the application, so that if someone developed the application separately and someone developed, and someone specified the filters separately, or if, let's say, the application developer doesn't have responsibility or doesn't have access to change the filters, how would they then be able to get programmatic information back in a response header? This would make it so that they couldn't. I was actually expecting there to be a way to programmatically change this based on something that would happen based on activity in the application on the back end. I was surprised to see it hard coded here, to tell you the truth.
John.
Isn't it, I could be missing some of the nuance here, but it seems like it's fairly common in APIs to allow variables in headers. I know Envoy has it, for example. I sent a link there. I've seen Google Load Balancer has it as well. And in these cases, they're really just doing like a variable interpretation of, I mean, in Envoy, in this case, it's these %sign things. I think it's a different format in Google, for example. I don't know if we want to be really strict here, but one option is we can just say that the value doesn't need to necessarily be passed as is, as a static constant in the implementation. It's kind of implementation specific how they interpret the value. That does sound kind of scary, because like we're saying that they could set whatever header they want, but at the same time, like, it also is pretty straightforward. If obviously Envoy implementation, they would set this, if you see downstream remote address, replace it with the downstream remote address. Just an idea if we wanted to do that. And we actually already do that in Istio, so if we don't want to do that, we should say that don't do that.
Thanks for the reference. Yeah, I didn't have a good reference off the top of my head.
Is this the kind of thing that you were describing? Just, a known header value, and you just want to interpolate it with some kind of variable type thing, like is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I know the same thing, this kind of thing is broader, it can be used for matching, it can be used for a variety of things. And I think, to me, this feels like something that is not completely prevented by this get. It feels like future extension could work to add this kind of capability. Yeah, thank you for this reference. That helps. I don't know. Any other thoughts? Yeah, maybe Candace, does this feel like something that could be added at a future point, or do you want to make sure it gets in up front?
I think it could be added in the future, but I think, like John mentioned, that we could say that it's being considered for the future, and not possible in this release.
Keith?
Is there anything in the get preventing something like this, like explicitly saying this is not allowed in the spec? I haven't gathered that from what I've read so far, but if there's not anything explicitly preventing that, then I feel like, I might be wrong, but I feel like that's probably implementation specific. like John mentioned, the Envoy, Nginx, Google, whichever, your proxy can have those kinds of behaviors that users, if they're tied to that proxy, gateway, whatever, they can utilize the functionality, and then the spec of Gateway API can codify the behavior at a future time. But if the GEP as it stands does prohibit that behavior, then technically, like John mentioned, Envoy implementations may be like non-conformant kind of by accident. So I do think that if we just need to make sure that the GEP doesn't prohibit it, we probably are in a pretty good spot to come back later and codify the exact behavior. It's my perspective anyway.
No, that makes sense. It's a good point that if we're not doing anything to expressly prevent that from happening, it's probably already supported. Yeah,
I mean, it does make a bit of an any pattern in that it'll mean that there's a big gotcha if you move from a gateway implemented by Envoy to a gateway implemented by another proxy that doesn't support the percent encoding, and you're using the percent encoding for setting those values, then you would end up screwed. But yeah, but like it seems like the idea of programmatically setting the value of a header at the proxy layer based on the value of some other header is pretty common. Like, you know, pretty much, I think most proxies have the ability to do that. And so I guess is that feels to me like it might be why you're a bit surprised, Candace, is that most of the proxies can do it already. Why would we not? And so I think in my mind, I've generally tended to err on the side of let's be specific. And but I think in this case it's probably fine. It's just that we need to call it out in there to say we're not explicitly stopping you from doing this right now, but you know, be aware that if you do use proxy specific strings in these values, then it will tie you to gateways that do that, and it might break.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. While we're on this gap, are there any other things we should talk about? I tried to read through a lot of this feedback, but there are a lot of comments, and I've likely missed some. So I'm aware of the two that Sanskar mentioned in Slack as kind of the larger themes of things that haven't been resolved. But if we resolve those and merge this, is there something we've missed that we should make sure to address first?
John brought up that a lot of the things that apply to response headers in this GEP will be apply to requests as well. Do we want to have any kind of promise of compatibility between the two in the spec, or do you want to leave them independent?
It seems like, yeah, that's a good question. Yes, I feel like these should be as consistent as possible. It seems like we almost need a separate issue or something just to track a reference to this is probably possible. If you're using it, it's not going to be portable across underlying implementations. And it would have the same behavior for request and response header modification. That doesn't seem like it's necessarily a blocker on, well, basically, I don't want to make a gap around response header modification, have to update the request header docs. But yeah, I agree. We need some kind of follow-up here.
I mean, even generally, as far as parity between response header and request header, they're separate. Yeah, they're separate resources, so they should be independent. But I don't know, oftentimes there might be kind of a goal of keeping them in, representative and not having things in one but not the other. But that might just come about naturally, so might not be worth calling out. Just wanted to ask the question though.
Oh, got it. Yeah, I think that will come naturally with this proposal because the proposal is to use the same API type and just a different name for it. but it could be worth explicitly stating that as a goal too.
Yeah, I think I agree that I think the two things that you called out there are the two other things. I think it's actually a really good, in some ways, it's a really good usage of the policy attachment, and a really good example of how you would use policy attachment. I think that every time people mention policy attachment, some part of me sort of makes an ouch face, because I don't think I've done when I wrote that, I don't think I did a good enough job of explaining it clearly, because it seems like there's a lot of information in that page, and I don't think there's enough examples there to be clear as to how it all works. Like, I think Candace, you mentioned in one of the things about defaults and overrides, and I think that's one of the key things that makes policy attachment useful in my mind. So that needs to be like exceptionally well explained. And so I think I definitely it's been on my to-do list for a while to sort of go over that page again and redo it. But it's sort of moving up, I guess. But I think that to give the shortest summary I can, the idea is that the policy attachment allows you to attach things in various places in the tree that is the Gateway API resource set. Like there is effectively a DAG of Gateway API resources: gateway class, gateway routes, services, secrets. And so the point of a policy attachment is to allow you to attach something at the gateway level that will then interact with things in the rest of the thing. And that's what the defaults part is for. The defaults one is to allow you to say, in this case, add a default header, but the default implies that you can override it at the route level. So if you add a default header at the gateway, then it's allowed to add that same header with a different value at the route level. Whereas if you do override, it's like, I'm the administrator and I get to tell you what to do, and you can't change this. So if you want to add HSTS or some other security thing, then you can say no, you can't. You don't get to change that. And so that's the idea behind the defaults and overrides, for example. But like obviously that is the fact that I mean, that's not the first time I've heard that question, says that I haven't done a good enough job of writing that documentation to be parsable by people who are not me. So yeah, I need to redo that.
Yeah, I'll share lots of responsibility on that. Policy attachment could use some better documentation. So any volunteers are very welcome too. Next up on this, I think this is Mark's. Oh, it's merged. Never mind. I copied the triage from last week, and great. A couple are already resolved, and we already talked about 1282. So I think that leaves us with one left, and this was a comment by Travis. I think you're on the call. Yeah. Maybe you can summarize better than me.
What's the quick summary of this? So we have to we want to make it, a conformance thing for what the order of headers is when you add them or remove them or replace them or whatever. And I think that one simple way to do this is that there's basically, the RFC standard for if you're providing multiple values for the same header, that you just do it into CSV. So if we just enforce that you have to, you are not allowed to say add header xfoo red and then add header xfoo blue, and then, as many xfoo adds or sets as you want. You're just only allowed to do any given header name once, and you have to provide all the different values that you want with it in that CSV format. And that allows us to basically say that, we don't need to worry about the order of multiple adds. It's already encoded in the value that you give us. And it is the value that you provide is exactly the value that you get at the other end.
This is probably a dumb question, but is that something we could just interpret from the spec? Require implementations to read?
It's a question of if we do allow multiple add clauses for the same header name, then we have to make some sort of choices about how we organize them.
But if those choices are basically what you said of sequential CSV, could we just merge them all together in the order they're in the spec and comma separate them?
Yeah, so like that's like it's perfectly reasonable to just say like if you get a bunch of ads, just go in the array order that you get them in. That was just kind of like the question of how to actually handle that was kind of the gist of this issue.
Got it.
Let me try to think of any other points I wanted to mention. I think it maybe gets like a bit more complicated with like if you add sets as well, because they can just like interact with one another. But other than that,
Yeah, that's okay. That's what what I meant to ask about.
Yeah.
Were you proposing here that we basically only let a value be add, set, or removed once per filter kind of thing? So it could only have one operation happen to it?
essentially, yeah, I don't remember if there's anything that actually matters with removes there, but like probably I
that was
don't think
my
it would
read.
make sense to like so I guess you have to choose the because I guess at least going from the example of our implementation, I know I think we have the other way around where we cannot choose like our order of operations, but that is something that the spec has to do regardless. So we basically need to say like if we do allow it, does remove xfoo and then add xfoo result in xfoo at the end, or does the add get canceled out by the remove?
It feels like it doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which options we pick, as long as we pick some options, right? Like the most important part there is that we write down these are the rules, and that's the end of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Like rather than this, like I mean, the details of the specific options are important, but like the most important deliverable here is that we have a set of rules that we write down and be like, that's the rules. Like,
yeah, I mean, I just kind of I like to see it like just provide the CSV directly version, just because like it is unambiguous as to what you're giving it and what you're getting out at the end. Like you get exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
The other half of that is like I don't think it like the only thing that I think this like doing that version limits you from doing is if you wanted to actually allow RFC violations, which we are in HTTP land, so those may be quite prevalent in some cases. But if you wanted to actually like allow it to say like 2 ads actually gets you 2 instances of the added header in the request that goes upstream, and it's up to upstream to like concatenate them. Which something may require, I hope not, but it's not outside the realm of possibility that something does that.
I definitely recall a number of occasions where Contour had people being like, our app does this extremely busted non-RFC compliant thing. Why doesn't Contour support it? And I'm like, don't make me tap the RFC. But I think my preference is that in general, we should be like, hey, no, we're going to do what the RFCs say. And if you want to do something that's not RFC compliant, then more power to you, but we'll see you around. Have fun.
Write your own custom filter.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I really appreciate that. I'm not gonna lie, it took me 3 reads through to parse this because it's been a long time since I went that deep into header mechanics. But I think that what you're saying is very reasonable.
I know we're past time here. This does not, to me, feel like something that needs a gap. But if anyone is open, Travis, you've written a lot here. If you're open to translating this into basically an API spec change or update, I think that would be easiest to reason through and review.
Yeah, I don't suppose we have the luxury of whoever was the other respondent on the call, do we?
Yeah, the other person on the call, Tokers, was against, I think, what Travis position. So I think we at least need to confirm with them that
maybe they didn't respond to the second version of it.
However, we also need to ensure that we keep movement on this. So I think I propose some sort of lazy consensus period where we say, hey, we're gonna do something like this in if we don't hear from anybody in the next 2 days, 3 days, some period of time. And then that way there's a time box amount of time where you need to wait, Travis, before like actually doing something.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much. We are past time, but thanks for the great conversation. And Travis, if you don't mind following up on that issue, thank you for great comments already. And think we'll cut it there.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.